where we're going to see the prophecy of Judas's betrayal fulfilled here in a moment, but then we'll also see the prediction fulfilled of Peter denying Jesus, because we're going to try and get to the end of the chapter today. But if you recall from last week, we saw how in our passage last week there were two key moments that help us understand the meaning and significance of the cross. And the first one is in the Lord's Supper, where Jesus is actually giving his disciples the framework of understanding that they ought to have. He's saying, if you are my follower, this is how you are to understand what is about to happen. Now, of course, they still didn't understand what was about to happen, but Jesus was very wisely preparing his disciples to be able to understand the significance and spiritual meaning of what he was about to do. Because he was teaching them that he was about to make a sacrifice. He wasn't just an innocent man caught in the wrong place at the wrong time and being crushed under the heel of Rome. No, it was far more than that. That he was actually an offering, a sacrifice provided by God, and Jesus was actually the great high priest offering his own body as the spotless and perfect Lamb of God that takes away sin, and he was both the offerer and the offering. And so that's what he's teaching his disciples with these two pictures, the picture of the bread and the picture of the cup, which he calls the blood of the covenant, or as the Gospel of Luke and also the Apostle Paul says in 1 Corinthians 11, the new covenant. And so we looked at some of the significance behind that last time. And then the second major point that helps us understand what was happening at the cross comes in the Garden of Gethsemane, when Jesus is praying with such fervor and such intensity that he says, "My soul is sorrowful even to the point of death." So this was a titanic spiritual struggle that Jesus was going through in these final hours. And he mentions the cup there, the cup of God's wrath, as we see from the Old Testament. That the reason Jesus is going through this spiritual struggle is because he understands the spiritual significance of what is about to happen on the cross. It's not just a physical death, as horrible and horrific as that was. Even more horrific was the outpouring of God's wrath for the sin of all who would believe in him, poured out upon his Son, that he would take it on our behalf. And so that is also a key moment in helping us understand the cross and the significance of the cross. Now today, we're going to see what I would call a third key moment, a third key picture or thing that helps us understand something very important about the cross. And that is when Jesus confesses before the council, the Sanhedrin, which is like the Supreme Court of Israel, he confesses who he is. Because in that moment, we now understand, okay, this is who is going to be hanging on that cross. We get the identity of who it is that is going to the cross. Not just a prophet, not just a descendant of David, not just a great man, not just a good man, not an innocent man, but truly the Son of God. And so when we begin to put these pieces together, we really do begin to get a full sense of what the cross means. That it's the blood of the new covenant, so it's a sacrifice. It's the taking of the wrath of God upon himself in those hours of darkness. And it's the identity of who he is. Who is that man hanging on the cross? He is nothing less than the very Son of God, as we will see.
While he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, arrived. With him was a large crowd, armed with swords and clubs, sent from the chief priests and the elders of the people. Now the betrayer had arranged a signal with them.
The one I kiss is the man. Arrest him.
Going at once to Jesus, Judas said,
Greetings, Rabbi.
and kissed him. Jesus replied,
Friend, do what you came for.
Then the men stepped forward, seized Jesus, and arrested him. With that, one of Jesus' companions reached for his sword, drew it out, and struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear.
Put your sword back in its place,
Jesus said to him,
for all who draw the sword will die by the sword. Do you think I cannot call on my Father, and he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels? But how then would the Scriptures be fulfilled that say it must happen in this way?
At that time, Jesus said to the crowd,
Am I leading a rebellion that you have come out with swords and clubs to capture me? Every day I sat in the temple courts teaching, and you did not arrest me. But this has all taken place that the writings of the prophets might be fulfilled.
Then all the disciples deserted him and fled. Those who had arrested Jesus took him to Caiaphas the high priest, where the teachers of the law and the elders had assembled. But Peter followed him at a distance, right up to the courtyard of the high priest. He entered and sat down with the guards to see the outcome. The chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for false evidence against Jesus, so that they could put him to death. But they did not find any, though many false witnesses came forward. Finally, 2 came forward and declared,
This fellow said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days.
Then the high priest stood up and said to Jesus,
Are you not going to answer? What is this testimony that these men are bringing against you?
But Jesus remained silent. The high priest said to him,
I charge you under oath by the living God. Tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God.
Yes, it is as you say.
Jesus replied,
But I say to all of you, in the future you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One, and coming on the clouds of heaven.
Then the high priest tore his clothes and said,
He has spoken blasphemy. Why do we need any more witnesses? Look, now you have heard the blasphemy. What do you think? He is worthy of death.
They answered. Then they spit in his face and struck him with their fists. Others slapped him and said,
Prophesy to us, Christ. Who hit you?
Now Peter was sitting out in the courtyard, and a servant girl came to him.
You also were with Jesus of Galilee.
She said, but he denied it before them all.
I don't know what you're talking about,
he said. Then he went out to the gateway where another girl saw him and said to the people there,
This fellow was with Jesus of Nazareth.
He denied it again with an oath.
I don't know the man.
After a little while, those standing there went up to Peter and said,
Surely you're one of them, for your accent gives you away.
Then he began to call down curses on himself, and he swore to them.
I don't know the man.
Immediately, a rooster crowed. Then Peter remembered the word Jesus had spoken.
Before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times.
And he went outside and wept bitterly.
In the space of these verses. And so if we go back to the beginning, we know that Jesus has been in the Garden of Gethsemane praying for several hours, as he prays 3 times the same prayer, and if it's all the same length, it's an hour he spends in each of those 3 sessions. And then he says in verse 46, Rise, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand. So it seems that Jesus had separated himself off from the main group of disciples. So now he and Peter and James and John are now coming back to the larger group of disciples. And as they're doing this, then Judas comes. It seemed to be Jesus' practice to spend time in this garden. So Judas is aware of it. He knows it, because as our text says, he is one of the 12. That heightens the betrayal of what's happening here. says, with him a great crowd with swords and clubs, sent from the chief priests and the elders of the people. It's the Gospel of John that actually provides a lot of details here that isn't found in Matthew. John actually gives us a sense of the size of this group. And he uses a military technical term that would sort of be equivalent to something like a regiment. Like they sent a regiment of soldiers. That is not a small group of soldiers. So if we were to take what John says very literally rather than just saying, oh, it's a really large group of soldiers, then that could be close to 400 soldiers who have been sent to arrest Jesus, according to John's Gospel. So this is, when it says a great crowd with swords and clubs, yes, it is a very big crowd of people, and they are armed to the teeth. And it says that the betrayer, that's Judas, had arranged a sign with them. Basically, the one I kiss is the man, arrest him. So that's the signal, the one that I kiss. And that has become, a very well-known thing, Judas's kiss, the kiss of betrayal. But it's always interesting what's really going on here. And I remember when I lived in Korea, I went to a Korean church where there were a lot of Korean people just learning English. And I was part of a Bible study where we were studying this scene together. And there was a young Korean guy who didn't speak English too well. And so there's a young lady who was trying to explain to him what's happening because he was a little confused. And she kept it very simple, and she just told him, everyone is scared. Everyone is very scared in this moment. And that always stuck out in my mind because I'd never thought of that before. I thought these are big, tough soldier guys coming to get Jesus. You're going to lay hands on Jesus. But that really stuck with me, and you know what? I think she was very right. I think she was more right than she even knew. Because I think everybody is scared here in this moment. And that's why you send 400 guys to go arrest a skinny little rabbi. Right? Because what have they heard about this rabbi? They've heard rumors that are probably even bigger, but they've heard he can heal the sick. He has raised paralytics. They can walk. He's healed the blind. He's touched lepers, and they've recovered their health.
His word has authority.
His word has authority. That's right. He's even raised that Lazarus guy from the dead. We heard. So if they have any sense at all, they're like, well, we have no idea what's going to happen. And if they are schooled in the Old Testament, remember what happened when the king sent men to arrest the prophet Elijah? That's one of those weird little stories in the Bible. That happens at the very beginning of 2 Kings. The king sends a squad of 50 soldiers to go arrest the prophet Elijah while he's on a mountain. And so they come and they say, "Come down, Elijah. The king wants to talk to you." And Elijah prays, and fire from heaven comes down and consumes that squad of soldiers. And so the king says, well, let's just do it again. And he sends another squad of 50 soldiers, and again, they say, "Come down, Elijah, because you got to go talk to the king." And same thing happens. He prays, and fire from heaven comes down and consumes them all. And so they send a third squadron of soldiers. They come, and this officer is a little smarter, a little wiser, and a little more humble. He says, "Please, sir, could you kindly come with us? We would not," I'm paraphrasing, of course, "we would not like to die. Please, if you'd be so kind, if you could come with us." And so Elijah is directed by God to go with them, and he does. So if they know that story, they might think to themselves, have we brought enough guys?
Yeah.
Right? And so there's this, we should feel a very real tension a very real fear as to what is going to happen. And I think the disciples feel it too, because we know there would have been the 11 with Jesus, because Judas is on the other side now. They would have been shocked to see Judas coming and seeing he's leading this crowd of soldiers armed to the teeth with torches and everything. So they would have been quite disturbed by this. They're on edge. It says that even, I'll skip ahead a couple of verses, because one guy jumps the gun and he draws a sword. And again, we know from John, we know who that is. We know that's Peter himself, hot-headed Peter. He's ready to go. He's ready to fight. He just said, Jesus, I will die with you. I won't ever deny you. So I'm ready. I'm ready to fight. I'm ready to die. So he draws a sword. He cuts off the ear of the servant of the high priest. Again, we know his name from John's Gospel. His name is Malchus. And so that all that tells us that everyone's afraid. Everyone's on edge. The disciples probably, they were ready to fight, but they didn't expect to have to fight right now. But they're ready to lay their lives down for their master.
This is what they've been looking for since they were picked by Jesus.
Oh yeah, yes.
This is the fight that we always wanted. We're here now. You can almost feel it.
Oh yes.
You know,
yes,
the talk
yes.
amongst them.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah. So it's a very dramatic moment, and they're all looking to Jesus. What's he going to do? Because they know he's the Messiah. They believe he's the Messiah. So they know if Jesus says fight, they're very confident they're going to win because the Messiah is on their side. But they're all looking to him. And I think that's why, that explains part of the reason why Judas arranges this kiss.
What about the rumor that the Romans believed that he had come, the reason Jesus came was to get rid of the Romans, get rid of the Roman government.
So you're asking about the Roman perspective on that?
Yeah, the Roman perspective. Maybe that's why they sent so many soldiers.
Well, it appears that these are all Jewish soldiers. I mean, there might be debate on whether this is Roman soldiers or Jewish soldiers. I get the sense it's mainly Jewish soldiers at this point. But yes, really, that's what the Jewish leaders are able to twist the arm of the governor, Pontius Pilate, to say, no, you think this guy's innocent, but he's a real threat to Rome. Because if he gets an army behind him, and he's calling himself the Messiah, you know, your position in Rome is going to be... And so I think that's ultimately why Pontius Pilate, you know, washes his hands, ultimately. But I don't know how aware the Romans would have been. I think maybe they were vaguely aware that the Jewish people believed in a coming Messiah and that he'd be a great king, and that I'm sure they were aware on some level. But they often just dismissed Jewish beliefs as silly backwater beliefs anyway, that they didn't care much about. So it's hard to say. But what I was going to say here is I think that's part of the reason why Judas arranges the signal as being a kiss. Because it's sort of like, if I can get close enough to kiss Jesus, then you don't have to be worried that he's going to, you know, do some magical thing and call down fire from heaven, or, you know, speak a word and you guys will all be dead. I think that's part of the signal that Judas is arranging here. And again, in the Gospel of John, I love how it shows that Jesus is actually in control of this situation. Because in John's Gospel, they actually ask Jesus to identify himself. They say, or Jesus actually asks, "Who are you looking for?" And they say, "Jesus of Nazareth." And he says, "I am." And in the Gospel of John, it says, the whole group, all 400 of them, including Judas, fall on their backsides. And so they get up back into their feet and they say, Jesus says again, "Who are you looking for?" They say, "Jesus of Nazareth." And he says, "Well, I already told you that it's me." And then he allows them to arrest them. So all that's happening too. We know Jesus is in control of the situation. So they might bring an army against Jesus. And as he even says right here, when he's rebuking Peter, he tells him to put his sword back in its sheath. Verse 53 is very interesting, isn't it? He says there, "Do you think that I cannot appeal to my Father, and he will at once send me more than 12 legions of angels?" And a legion was usually around 6,000 men. So I don't know if anybody can do the math quickly, but that's 12 legions, that's of 6,000 each. And that's sort of the minimum. That's a lot of angels. And I'm sure that's a minimal number. This is the Son of God. God could say, oh yeah, we're sending the whole heavenly host to protect the Son of God. And so that even informs us that Jesus is in control of this situation in this moment. He's the only one who's not afraid here. And what he's doing is he is actually submitting to the Father's will. And he continues in verse 54, "But how then should the Scriptures be fulfilled that it must be so?" That's his way of submitting to the Father's will and the Father's plan. Because he's saying, well, God ordained that it would be so. He prophesied it in the Old Testament Scriptures, and so therefore I must fulfill them. And if you noticed, he says it a second time in verse 56. And it's Jesus again. He says, "But all this has taken place that the Scriptures of the prophets might be fulfilled." So Jesus is very mindful of what he is doing here as a fulfillment of the prophecy found in the Old Testament. And what he primarily, most likely has in mind is Isaiah 53. That's the big chapter. That is, but probably the other passages in Isaiah that talk about the suffering servant as well. But it all culminates in Isaiah 53. That he is the suffering servant. And for him to be the suffering servant, he has to be a servant who suffers. And this is part of that process, to fulfill the Scriptures, to be submissive to the Father's plan. And so that's what we see going on here. That yes, he might be delivered into their hands, but only because he has allowed it. And it says in the last part of verse 56, "Then all the disciples left him and fled." They fled into the night. And that is such an interesting flip of the switch here. 1 second, they are ready to go. They've got the swords drawn. They may only have 2 swords among them, but they're going to use those swords to good effect. They are ready to go. But as soon as they see Jesus surrendering himself into their hands, that is when it's like the jig is up. And it must, from a human perspective, it must have just confused them so tremendously that it just short-circuited their brains, and then it went from, the flight or flight response, so it went from fight to flight in a moment, and they all left him and fled. And so that's the first section, where really we do see Jesus in control of this situation. From a human perspective, we would think, oh, Jesus is in real trouble here. This is a bit of an aside, but there are those late night comedy shows, and of course they're very irreverent, and anything they mention about Christianity or the Bible is going to be very irreverent. And I always remember one skit where a guy is sitting at a table or something, and he's reading the Bible, and he says, oh, he reads it super fast. He just skims through the whole thing, and he says, poor Jesus. As if that is the whole summary of the Bible. Poor Jesus. But anyone who's actually read the Bible, and read it page by page, is not thinking, poor Jesus. Yes, he went through horrific, unimaginable suffering, but he is in control of this situation. the only reason they can arrest him is because he allows them to arrest them. And even again, going back to the Gospel of John, in the very last moment, I love how it says, when Jesus breathed his last, it says that he gave up his spirit. It's like Jesus doesn't die until he's good and ready. It's like he is the one who is truly giving up his spirit. In the Gospel of John, there's a pattern. The soldiers give up Jesus to the council. The council gives up Jesus to the governor Pontius Pilate. Pontius Pilate gives up Jesus to the soldiers who lead him to the cross. But then finally on the cross, it's Jesus who gives up his spirit. And then you're like, ding! Oh, you mean Jesus was actually the one really in sovereign control of everything that is happening to him. And so we catch a glimpse of that here in Matthew when Jesus says, hey, I could have 1 billion angels here at a snap of a finger, but I'm going to submit to my Father's will and my Father's plan, and I'm going to go through this. Because not my will, but his be done, as he had prayed in the garden. And so that brings us to the middle section of Jesus before the Sanhedrin, or the council, which is the most powerful man in Israel. And the high priest that year was Caiaphas, and so Jesus is led to Caiaphas's house, and the Sanhedrin is gathered there while they deliberate what is going to happen to Jesus. And we have the note that Peter, he has run away, but he follows. He still wants to find out what is happening to Jesus. And so he's in the courtyard outside, warming himself at a bonfire. And so he wants to see what's going to happen. And so verse 59, if we look there, we learn that this is a sham trial. So this is not legal at all. The high priests are just trying to push this thing through and get the deed done. They've had it with Jesus. This is their opportunity. They're going to ram the thing through no matter what. But they need some kind of legitimacy, don't they? As much as they'd love to just take Jesus out back and, cut him down, they can't really do that, because just a few chapters ago we saw Jesus still super popular. And if the people find out that they've treated Jesus, whom they consider to be a prophet, like this, and many people think maybe he's the Messiah too, then they're going to have a big problem on their hands. So they need some form of legitimacy. But the pesky problem they have is that the Torah says that you have to have 2 or better, even better, 3 testimonies in agreement. And for the life of them, they can't get 2 to agree. Because the whole idea is you bring in one with the other witness sequestered, and you hear his testimony, and then you dismiss that guy and bring in the other guy, and he gives the testimony. That's the whole idea. So they're not giving testimony together, because then they could sort of massage the testimony as they're doing it. So it's separate testimonies, but the problem is none of what they're saying is lining up, and everybody sort of sees it. And so that's what's going on here when it says there's false testimonies, but verse 60 says, but they found none. So imagine their frustration building. They really want to put Jesus to death. They really want the sentence of death here, but they can't get it because nothing is really adding up here. The false testimonies are not working out. And then finally, it says 2 of them came forward, and it sounds like their testimonies sort of agreed that they heard Jesus say, I'm able to destroy the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days. And that's really bad. You speak against a temple like that, and yeah, you're going to get it. Now really, what they're talking about is not even found in the Gospel of Matthew. It's only found in the Gospel of John. And that's not what Jesus said in the Gospel of John. Jesus said, if you guys destroy this temple, I will raise it up in 3 days. And John says that Jesus was talking about his own body. But they're saying, no, Jesus' claim was that he was going to destroy the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days. And so they can't even get that right. This is clearly a false testimony as well. But the high priest has had it, and he stands up and he tries to say this is legitimate. He says, have you no answer to make? He's addressing Jesus here. What it is that these men testify against you. The Greek is a little stronger than what we have in my Bible. It's what it is that these men are solemnly testifying against you. It's like he's saying, these guys really got you here, Jesus. What do you have to say about this one? But verse 63 says that Jesus remained silent. Jesus has been quiet this whole time. And normally you think, well, if you're innocent, you're going to be protesting your innocence. But I think Jesus' silence is a way of shaming the whole thing. His silence is saying, you know, I know this is false, you know this is false. This is a kangaroo court and a sham trial, and I'm not participating. That's what his silence is saying. And so the high priest is really he's sort of backed into a corner at this point. Because even these testimonies that they've just heard are a little shaky. And so really, the high priest has one card left to play. He has to get a confession from Jesus himself. Because if they get that, it's done. And so that's what he's going to go for. And here, so the high priest gets in Jesus' face, and he says very sternly, I'm sure using all of his earthly authority, he says, I adjure you by the living God, tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God. That is a very big question. And what's interesting here is in Matthew, he uses this word adjure. That's not a word we use much in our common language. Does anyone have anything else other than adjure?
I charge you under oath.
Yeah, that's really nice. Is that the NIV?
Yeah.
Yeah, the NIV sometimes puts it very nicely. Yeah, I charge you under oath. So when you adjure someone, you are actually putting them under oath, which in this culture, in this religious context, is very serious. If Jesus remains silent now, after the high priest has said this, now Jesus' silence would be taken as a kind of lie. Because to adjure or to put someone under oath implies the name of God, the name of Yahweh. And the ninth covenant says, the ninth commandment from the 10 Commandments says, you shall not give false testimony. And so it's like the high priest is forcing Jesus to speak in this moment by adjuring him or putting him under oath. We don't have to go there, but in Joshua chapter 7, do you remember that story of Achan? Where Achan hides some of the plunder of Jericho, and that's why the next battle of Ai doesn't go so well, and the Israelites lose that one. It's because all of the plunder from Jericho was not supposed to be taken. And yet one guy took a little bit for himself, Achan. And so you remember the story how by casting of lots, they get the tribe, and then the clan, and then the families, and then finally it falls to Achan. And Achan is brought before Joshua. Remember what Joshua does? He says, give glory to God and praise to the Holy One of Israel, my son. And that was a way of putting Achan under oath before God. Because Achan knows if he says anything, he's going to die. But Achan still had such a high regard for the God of Israel. Once he was put under oath by Joshua using that formula, that oath formula, Achan had no choice to be an honorable man in any sense. But he had to tell the truth, and that's why immediately he tells the truth of what he did. And so I think there's a similar thing going on here. That the high priest thinks he's put Jesus on the ropes right now by adjuring him by putting him under oath in this moment, you have to tell us right here and right now, Jesus, who are you? And his question is, are you the Christ, the Son of God? And I think that's a very important question. Because I think what Caiaphas is saying there in this moment is he's saying, what kind of Christ are you claiming to be? Because claiming to be the Messiah wasn't really a new thing. There had been other guys who had claimed to be the Messiah before Jesus. We find that out in the book of Acts, where the great rabbi Gamaliel, he says, hey guys, remember that guy who led a bunch of guys with him out into Egypt? And that came to nothing. And then there was another guy who tried an uprising. So those might have been guys who claimed to be the Messiah. So this wasn't really new to claim to be the Messiah or the Christ. But he's really asking, what kind of Messiah are you claiming to be? And he's saying, are you claiming to be the kind of Christ, or the kind of Messiah who is the Son of God? So when you, Jesus, when you use the term Messiah, are you using that as a code for Son of God? Because if Jesus says yes to that, then it's done. They've got their blasphemy charge. Because to be the Son of God is to claim divinity in that context. So he's really putting it to Jesus. Are you claiming to be the Christ that is not just the Son of David, but the Son of God himself? And so here is that key moment that I was referring to. Got a lot of lead up to this. So there's the new covenant in my blood at the Lord's Supper. There's the cup of God's wrath in Garden of Gethsemane. And now we come to the third key point here, which is Jesus' answer. Because how Jesus answers this question will either get him released and he loses all credibility among the people and he fades away into obscurity and the Jewish leaders have won, or the Jewish leaders win in another way by he declares blasphemy and the trial is done. They've got what they wanted and he's on his way to the cross. So this is a very key answer. This is a life or death moment. You could argue that this is the most important thing Jesus will say in his whole ministry and life. Because this is the apex of everything. This is it. This is it. This is the moment. And what does Jesus say? You have said so. Which I think means you betcha.
Yeah.
That's what I think that is saying. You betcha. In Mark, he says it, yes, I am. He is very direct in Mark, but in Matthew, it's, you have said so. So that's an answer in the affirmative. But Jesus takes it even further. And what he does is he says, but I tell you, from now on, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. And so what Jesus is doing right there is he's taking two Bible verses from the Scriptures. He's taking, when he refers to the Son of Man and the clouds of glory, he's talking about Daniel 7:13, which is this heavenly figure, the Son of Man, who's led into the presence of the Ancient of Days. And it says that this Son of Man receives glory and honor and even worship and service of all the peoples. So that's the Son of Man. And then he says, seated at the right hand of power. And that's an allusion to Psalm 110, verse 1, which is, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand. So what Jesus is doing is he's bringing both of them together. Because individually, they're sort of mysterious and they're sort of harmless. So if you think of two wires, right? You touch one wire, you're okay. You touch the other wire, you're okay. Because individually, they're okay. But what Jesus is doing here is he's bringing those two wires together. He's touching them together. And what happens? Boom! And that's why the high priest loses it. And he tears his cloak in grief and anger over what has happened. Because Jesus has joined the Son of Man from Daniel 7:13, with the second Lord. Yahweh said to my Lord, Lord Adonai. He's joining these two together, Son of Man plus the Lord, who sits at the right hand of the power, which is God. And so when you bring those things together, you've got the Son of Man, a heavenly, pre-existent being who's receiving all the honor and glory from the peoples, plus this kingly, heavenly figure who is sitting alongside Yahweh in heaven. You bring all that together, what Jesus is doing, and he is basically saying, you bet I am the Son of God. So Jesus doesn't back away from this threat. He actually leans into it. And he says, yes, I'm more the Son of God than you realize. And because every man sitting there listening to this knows the scriptures, and they instantly recognize these two allusions, that is why their minds explode in anger. And that's why when the high priest tears his robes and says, he has uttered blasphemy, what further witnesses do we need? They all answer, he deserves death. Everybody agrees here that yes, you claim those two things together about yourself, and yes, you have broken, Deuteronomy. I always mix it up. Is it 13 or 18? I think it's 18. Deuteronomy 18, which says, from the law, it says, you know, if your beloved son comes and whispers in your ear, hey Dad, let's go worship other gods. Yeah. You are to take your son out of the city, and your hand is supposed to be the first one on a stone to put him to death. If your beloved wife, your sweetheart, whispers in your ear and says, hey honey, let's go worship other gods, it's supposed to be your hand first in putting her to death. It is a very strong passage. And that is the basis of what they're saying here. They have heard, in what Jesus said, they have heard that he has claimed divinity here in this moment. And that's why, as believers, sometimes, you know, if we watch a lot of internet videos and things, we'll come across people who claim, well, Jesus never claimed to be God. Jesus never claimed to be the Son of God. Where does it say in the Bible that Jesus said, I am God, worship me? Well, the answer is, well, he didn't say those exact words, but anybody who knows the Bible and see what Jesus does here in a life or death moment knows, yes, they're going to put him to death for blasphemy on the basis of Deuteronomy 18. That what Jesus is doing in their minds, let's put ourselves in their sandals for a moment. In their minds, what has Jesus just done? Hey guys, let's go worship another God. Me. And so they feel fully justified. They feel fully justified in calling for his death at this point. And so in their minds, Jesus has walked right into their trap, and finally they are going to be all done with him. And so that's why even, look at how they treat him afterwards. It says they spit in his face and struck him. So these are the grown men and leaders of Israel treating him like this. It's the Sanhedrin. It's like thinking of the Supreme Court of Canada dressed in all their robes, and they're spitting on the one that they think is a criminal, and they slap him and they mock him. Prophesy to us, Christ. Who is it that struck you? So if you're the Christ, if you're the great prophet, if you're the Son of God, surely you know who just smacked your head from behind. So that's how confident they are now in this sentence of blasphemy. that they are doing God's will. He's not just a Sabbath breaker. He's not just a law fiddler. He's not just, confusing the people with his weird teachings about turning the other cheek and all that nonsense. No, he's done the big thing. He has claimed divinity for himself. So they are fully confident in this moment that they are doing the right thing. They are serving God in this moment. So then, finally, we come to the last part of the chapter where it is fulfilled, where Peter denies Jesus. He's out in the courtyard. A servant girl sort of recognizes him, that he was with Jesus. He denies it. That's a pretty normal denial. I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know what you mean. He gets out of there. He moves to a different area. It says another servant girl saw him, and so she starts talking to him, and she thinks he's also, part of that group of Jesus of Nazareth. Now he ratchets it up a notch, and he denied it with an oath. And what's implied there is probably he's using the name of Yahweh now, which is really now breaking the commandment, you shall not take the name of Yahweh in vain. But he's swearing by Yahweh, I do not know this man. I don't know who you're talking about. And then finally, it happens a third time. Other people come up and said to Peter, well, you've got to be part of the group. You got one of those hillbilly accents from up north. And so we know you're from Galilee, so you got to be with one of Jesus' number. And then, so he ratchets it up further. It's almost like he goes a little crazy at this point, and he invokes a curse on himself and to swear, I do not know the man. In the Old Testament, there was a common oath, and the NIV puts it really nicely, where it says, may God do to me, I'm getting a little confused now, the exact wording. May God deal with me, be it ever so severely, if I do such and such. That's the oath. We see that several times in the Old Testament. May God deal with me, be it ever so severely, if such and such. And that seems to be what Peter's doing here. May God deal with me, be it ever so severely, if I am with that man. And so he has used the strongest language possible. If it is correct that he has even used the name of God in his oath, he is trying desperately to convince people that he is not of Jesus' number. And when we understand that, we see, okay, it's a little bit more than simple denial. The simple denial is, yeah, I don't know what you're talking about. No, I don't know that guy. But no, this is desperate denial. This is, I will swear on a stack of Bibles that I don't know who you're talking about. I don't know Jesus. I've never seen or met that guy before in my life. No, I swear on my mother's grave. Right? It's using that kind of language, that stronger language to really put the emphasis on, no, I don't know him. And so finally, the rooster crows. He realizes what has happened. I think it's Luke's gospel. I think it's Luke's gospel that records the detail that actually Jesus is being transferred in this moment, and they actually lock eyes as the rooster crows. Oh, what a moment that would have been, right? It's like Jesus saying, yeah, I know what you did. And Peter realizes what he's done. And you would think that after the first and second denial, he'd be like, oh, wait a minute, Jesus just said this like 4 hours ago that I was going to do this. Okay, I won't do it the third time. But no, that was not part of things. And so he fulfills Jesus' prediction completely. And it says in the last verse, Peter remembered the saying of Jesus, before the rooster crows, you will deny me these 3 times. And he went out and wept bitterly. I think even in that moment, again we're reminded, Jesus is in charge of this whole situation. Because Jesus even knows what Peter's going to do, and he told him beforehand. So Jesus is actually in charge of all these things. But we do see in Peter's denial this spirit of regret and we could say repentance ultimately, because his reaction is much different than Judas's. As we'll see next week in chapter 27, Judas's reaction is to commit suicide, where Peter's reaction is to weep bitterly from the heart. And that's what repentance really is. It's genuine, true sorrow for the sin that we recognize we have perpetrated. And so there's even a lesson for us in the contrast of the two reactions of denying Jesus or betraying Jesus. I think we'll leave it there. Is there any interaction or any questions or anything you'd like to add?
In the scene in the Garden of Gethsemane, when Wayne read his, he said, "Have you come up against a rebel?" But in all of the verses I can see, it says robber. So what version are you using?
The Gideon Bible.
Okay.
Well, I don't know.
Yeah, I noted that as well.
Oh, okay. Wasn't just me.
International
Yeah,
version.
yeah, so I don't know. I'm pretty sure, without looking, that the Greek word underneath is more like bandit.
Yeah.
So, depending on the context, a bandit.
Because that's a significant difference in meaning.
Yes,
You
robber
know,
to rebel.
what do you mean? You think I'm a rebel?
Yeah,
Well, yeah. I mean, all of your disciples think you should be rebels.
yes.
But
New Living.
New Living, yeah.
but when
It's
when
paraphrasing a little bit there.
when it says robber, well, now you know he's making a point.
Yeah,
And it's
Yeah.
got very little to do with him. at this
yes.
point.
Yeah. You come out with your full SWAT team,
Yeah.
against a skinny little rabbi here, right? What are you guys doing? It's sort of to, put the shame back on them. Yeah, yeah. Well, that's a good note.
But also Jesus couldn't deny that when that priest accused him of blasphemy because he's Son of God and he doesn't lie.
That's right.
He
So he
had
was
to
telling
tell
the
the
full
truth.
truth.
So
Yeah.
He told the truth.
Yeah, yeah. And what's interesting, if we think about it, that is really the question that every human soul must answer in some way, shape, or form. Is Jesus the Christ, the Son of God? And the answer is, do we believe his answer or not? Do we believe that he's telling the truth? Or, by our rejection of Jesus, are we actually standing on the side of the Jewish leadership?
Right.
And really condemning him as a blasphemer. It was C.S. Lewis who said Jesus was either a liar, a lunatic, or Lord. He said he was either a liar whom we should hate, or he was a lunatic on the same level as a man who claims to be a poached egg, or he was the Lord of glory. That's what it comes down to. And really, if he was a lunatic, then he was lying anyway. So it's really, is he's a liar or he's telling the truth, and he is Lord. And really, that's what you're saying, one or the other. You're going to accept what Jesus says as the truth about himself, that he is the Son of Man, who is the divine Lord of heaven, sitting at the right hand of God, or he is a blasphemer. That's why it's always been, among modern Jewish people, they're always sort of a little bit embarrassed by the death of Jesus, almost as if they would say, well, if I was there, we wouldn't have done that. But I think, well, actually, no. If you truly believe Jesus is not the Messiah, he's not the Son of God, then really you should say, no, what they were doing was right. Jesus did deserve to die. If Jesus makes that claim and it's not true, then Jesus did deserve to die as a blasphemer in the most horrific way possible. He should have been stoned to death under Jewish law, if that was the case. But if that's not the case, if he was telling the truth, then what ought to be our reaction? It should be worship. It should be obedience and love and service. And so maybe we'll leave that as the application for us. If we believe